Drakkhen is a game. No, wait. Drakkhen is a video game. No, wait. Drakkhen is a role-playing game. No, wait. Drakkhen is a role-playing video game. No, wait. Drakkhen is a 3D role-playing video game that we're gonna play until we win. If you want to talk confusing lifespan, then this game qualifies. Drakkhen is a 3D role-playing game, originally made for the Amiga, published by Drakkhen, who later became Data East. It was then ported to several other systems, including MS-DOS by Infogrames in 1990, and the Super Nintendo by Kemco in 1991. And if you want to get really obscure, the game was also released on the Atari ST, PC-98, and FM Towns Marty. Of course, that's not all. Drakkhen, over its lifespan, has been changed and altered so much that the SNES game just barely resembles the original Amiga version. In fact, each subsequent release from the Amiga changed the game in some way. Either the graphics, gameplay, stats, enemies, or battle system was completely overhauled in each and every iteration. In other words, the Super Nintendo version of Drakkhen is a port of 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 the original Amiga game. Mind blown. Changes aside, Drakkhen was a game that came before its time. It's a 3D world, fully explorable from the beginning of the game, with a battle system that is uncomfortably reminiscent of Final Fantasy XIII. Sadly, the fighting system can be very boring, and its 3D environment couldn't really be implemented the way the designers wanted, so they had to settle for a hybrid between vector and bitmap graphics. The world itself is pretty large, and like most RPGs of today, you can actually explore the land as much as you want. Unlike RPGs of its time, Drakkhen didn't prevent you from wandering around, save for a few crazy old men that appeared from time to time to warn you about going to the southern desert. This does come at a very high cost. The world of Drakkhen is very barren, save for a few houses and exactly one tavern. The only interesting places to visit are the dungeons, and there aren't even that many of them. On the other hand, this game is loaded with monsters, and this is where Drakkhen completely diverges from traditional RPGs of its time. There are more random encounters than you can shake a stick at, and the player has almost zero control over the fight. Yeah, the only changes to the battle system that you can make are the character's equipment and the actions you can take, either fight, defend, or cast magic. But unlike Final Fantasy XIII, this concept actually works pretty well. The pseudo-3D fighting is so awkward that actually controlling your characters would be damn near impossible during the battle sequences. On the other hand, the battles are just maddeningly difficult. Since you don't directly control your characters, you can't control what they're going to do, and when the little fuckers decide to become complete pussies, there's nothing you can do but stare in awe as your fighter, your strongest character, runs away from the battle and let your scout, mage, and priest get absolutely slaughtered. The only way you can influence the battle in any way is by equipping your fighter and scout with the best armor and weapons possible, but we'll get back to that later. Unlike many RPGs of today and many PC RPGs of the time, you don't choose your party. Instead, you've always got one fighter, one scout, one magician, and one priest, and your stats are all based on dice rolls. And they're not even completely random. You're guaranteed to get a number between 5 and 18 each and every time, which means you have a better than 50% chance of getting a number higher than 10, and it seems no matter how many times you re-roll, you'll always get at least 1 or 2 14s. Oh, and you've got a very limited number of re-rolls, 3. Once you use your third roll, you have to assign stats to that character. So, essentially, once you've beaten the game, there's really no point in playing it again. You're going to have the same characters with the same abilities and roughly the same stats. Building your characters is a relatively simple affair, but we'll discuss it in depth because goddammit, it's an RPG and it deserves it. You start off by choosing the character's sex, which only affects the game in so much as the fighter becomes the Amazon and the priest becomes the priestess. There's no sense in choosing a class, just go down the line, since you're forced to choose one of each class. We'll start with the fighter. The fighter is the strongest class in the game and can deal massive damage. He can wear the best armor and weapons in the game but cannot cast magic. He's also a pain in the ass to keep equipped because he'll probably take the most damage. Oh, I didn't mention that, did I? Your equipment breaks in this game. Oh no, it breaks a lot. Believe me, this becomes a major problem later on in the game. Equipment problems aside, the fighter's main stat is, you guessed it, strength. So the highest roll you have should go there. Everything else for the fighter is completely pointless, so just assign them in any order you please. The scout is a lot like the fighter, able to use the best armor and weapons in the game. The only difference is that he can't deal out the same amount of damage. Of course, to balance this out, the scout has some of the most useful spells in the game. Now, you might think of the scout as this game's version of a thief, and you should max out his agility. And you'd be right if we were playing the game the developers intended it. However, go back to the description of the scout again. The scout is an underpowered fighter, so power his ass up. Max out his strength and fuck everything else. Believe me, you're not gonna regret this. What you will regret, though, is the Magician. Something as powerful and amazing as the Magician really ought to have been more useful in this game. His main stat is knowledge, but we'll get to why Angry Joe is so useless in this game in a bit. But first, there's the Priest. This character has one job and one job only. Keep the scout alive at all costs. Fuck the fighter, fuck the Magician. Keep that goddamn scout alive. Give the Priest the highest intelligence score to max out your healing abilities. Believe me, you need to focus your healing powers on the scout because it is a pain in the ass to lose him in this game. If you're paying attention, you may have noticed that I'm really high on the Scout and a downer on the Magician. Well, there's a reason for that. The Scout gets some of the most useful spells in the game, while the Magician gets the most destructive spells. This would normally not be a big deal, since the Mage in any fantasy RPG is usually the massive damage dealer, coming out of nowhere and blowing shit up with his fireball spells. Well, the same kind of holds true for this Magician. It's just that the mana pool for this guy is so small that he's practically useless in battle. Even with his amazing antimatter spell, the Magician just doesn't deal enough damage before his mana pool is completely depleted, forcing him to resort to melee attacks, and much like every other RPG on the planet, the Mage can't swing a sword worth a shit, and this is where the Scout completely and utterly trumps the Magician in every way possible. He gets all of the awesome spells that'll help you through the game. Now, he doesn't get spells like Fireball and Antimatter, but he does get infinitely useful light and unlock spells, and he gets them before the Magician does. I'm not kidding when I say these spells are incredibly useful. 90% of this game takes place in the dark, and 99% of the doors in this game are locked. You'll be using the same damn spells so often that you'll completely forget that magic has other uses besides turning on lights and unlocking doors. Hell, I felt so bad for the Magician that I used his unlock spell at later levels just to make Angry Joe feel like he was accomplishing something out of pity. On top of that, the Scout is a melee character. He can use the best armor and weapons in the game. Unlike the Magician, all he wears is a fucking coat. So, instead of thinking of the Scout as this game's thief, think of the Scout as this game's Magician who gave up on offensive spells and instead chose to kick ass with a sword and a shield. Oh sure, you could force the Mage to not use all of his mana before the end of a battle and save some so he could use the unlock spell, but the problem with that is that his damage per second takes a fucking nosedive into nothingness. Speaking of DPS, dealing out damage in this game is actually a careful balancing act between weapons and range. For the most part, you want to equip every single character with bows and arrows. That's right, your kick-ass fighter that can tear the hell out of enemies doesn't get a kick-ass sword, he gets bows and arrows. That Magician that can throw fucking antimatter, he gets bows and arrows. Why? Bows and arrows kick ass. The biggest problem with this game is that most of the enemies either attack with melee weapons or move so fast that melee attacks are useless. Now in the latter case, it's impossible to hit these guys with a sword, and in the former, it's pretty much guaranteed you won't get a hit. Of course, there are a few enemies that are ranged. These are either bosses or gigantic dog heads. In these cases, you either need to equip a couple of melee weapons that do more damage, or you need to run the fuck away. Now, there is some strategy involved in this game. It is, after all, an RPG, so knowing what cards to play and when to play them can be essential to winning the battle. Well, not really, and here's why. There are only two characters you want to directly control, and only one of them you'll control through most of the game. Those characters are the Magician and the Priest. Since the Fighter and Scout can't do anything but swing a sword, there's no point in controlling them, and the Magician is really only useful for throwing the occasional fireball around, so the one character you control the most is the Priest, because this damn game doesn't know when you need to heal people, so you have to do it for the game. Occasionally, you'll want to control the Magician and tell him to throw a fireball at the enemy. Now, you could tell him to throw fireballs automatically, but the dumbass Magician will literally tear through all of his mana in under a minute, making him entirely useless for the rest of the battle, and items that are used to recover your mana are nearly impossible to come across, so that means you have to buy them. The only problem is that the shop system in this game is whacked out. We all know that RPGs all have some kind of economic system. Most of them take the form of shops and inns. In Drakkhen, though, the economic system exists in the form of random encounters with wandering merchants. Now, everything costs something. In this game, it's Jade, and Jade is, quite frankly, damn hard to acquire. Well, it's not hard to acquire Jade so much as acquiring enough Jade to buy anything. I mean, look at this. The Dragon Sword costs 10 million Jade. Jeez, what do you think the business plan for that guy looked like? So, Mr. Merchant, you'd like a loan from our bank to set up a business, yes? I see your plan here states you're going to wander around the lands trying to sell overpriced merchandise to random people that happen to walk into you? I see. And you plan on turning a profit on the off chance you run into someone who can buy your $10 million sword from you in cash? Well, this plan is obviously flawless. I'll have the money transferred to your account tomorrow morning. On top of all that, the items available at the merchants change based on what part of the story you're on. So if you're on a later part of the story where the merchant doesn't carry all of the mana recovery potions that make the Magician not useless, you're screwed. Random encounter merchants, prices that are astronomical, and an ever-changing supply of inventory makes the economic system of Drakkhen utterly worthless. And you know what that means, kids? Thanks to the lack of mana-restoring potions, the Magician is utterly and hopelessly useless. Leveling in this game is very straightforward. You kill things, you get experience points. Get enough experience points, gain a level. Gain a level, your core stats improve. The higher your stats, the better your performance in battle, and so on. The problem here is the way leveling works. There are some quirks. First, if a character is dead, they don't gain XP. That's pretty standard, sure, but it's a problem when Angry Joe tries to slaughter everything with his stick and gets eaten alive. The next problem is that XP is awarded based on who killed the enemy, which means that your Fighter and Scout, your two melee characters, will level up fast, while your Magician and Priest will be left behind picking their noses. This is a significant problem, because the Magician doesn't get any offensive spells until level 4, while the Priest doesn't get offensive spells until much later in the game, meaning that in order to level them up, they have to attack with their melee weapons, and this is a huge problem because these two characters will die. A lot. Now, you could equip these characters with ranged weapons and they would be fine, if you could get your hands on them. The only problem here is that you can't get the bow and arrow until you're on the second part of the story. Before then, you can't buy them at a merchant and they won't appear in treasure chests. So, he has no offensive spells at the start of the game, gets no ranged weapon, and dies in only 1 or 2 hits. Throughout the whole first part of the game, your mage is completely worthless. Look, I know I'm harping on this whole the mage is worthless thing a lot, but it really bothers me. In almost any other RPG, the magic user is the guy who can turn the tide of a battle. He's the guy with the most powerful spells, the guy who can throw a fireball from his hands, make the earth explode beneath you, or summon a fucking meteor from the heavens to crush your opponent. But in this game, the mage is a weak little bitch that slaps things with a fucking stick. What the hell? As much as I bitch about the mage dying a lot because he's a suicidal, homicidal maniac with a stick, it's not as bad as it sounds because you can resurrect your characters in this game fairly easily. All you have to do is drag their corpse to the nearest anak, which actually looks like a bank, and I'm not entirely sure this isn't some kind of hidden message about the Jewish religion, and tell the mage-looking guy there to resurrect your asses. You could also listen to this guy preach, but it's long, boring, and doesn't explain anything that's going on in the game world, past or present, so the priest's dialogue is utterly meaningless. So, since you can revive your entire party for free, what's preventing you from keeping the priest alive, and if the party wipes, simply running away? Well, nothing, really. Except for the fact that if you're down to one player, it means that you've got to drag all 3 corpses back to the Anarch by yourself and pray to God you get your ass over there without any encounters. And that's a big problem in this game, because the number of random encounters is through the friggin' roof. Unlike most RPGs of the time, there's no magic formula for getting a random encounter. You don't step a certain number of squares and magically get sucked into a fighting vortex. Hell, you don't even need to move and you can get nailed with a random encounter in this game, and that's a huge problem, because it can lead to strange scenarios. Scenarios where you're just standing around waiting for that half-retarded mage of a character to regenerate his MP, and then suddenly, bam, you're hit with not 1, not 2, not even 3 encounters in a row. No, fuck that. You're hit with 15 encounters in a row with no rest, no time to recover, and this is the point where the leveling system can completely fuck you over. Remember when I said that the leveling system favors the characters that kill the monster? Well, when the game decides to go apeshit and send a swarm of enemies your way, your fighter and scout are going to leave the magician and priest in the dust, leaving you with a very, very boring task. Grind the fuck out of the other 2 characters until they level up enough to be on par with the 2 attackers. To mix things up, you can outfit your characters with a variety of weapons and armor. Aside from the bows and arrows, you've got an array of stuff to choose from. Unlike other RPGs of its time, namely Final Fantasy, the equipment is all pretty bland. You're not going to find any mithril armor here. No, it all has the same names and falls into the same range of categories, namely light, medium, heavy, power, hyper, and dragon, as in the light helmet, the medium cuirass, the dragon armor, and so on. Aside from those types of armor and weapons, there's also the plus modifier. If you've ever played an MMO or a tabletop game, you know what I'm talking about. +0, +1, +2, or +3. For example, the light helmet, +2. It's a small thing, but that plus modifier can really carry you through the game. And if you're really obsessive, you can spend all your time trying to get the dragon armor +3, but we'll get into that bit of OCD later. Out of all the stuff this game doesn't have in common with RPGs of its time, it does have one common bond with them: grinding. Oh, the level grinding you will do. For those of you who don't remember, don't know, or don't care, RPGs used to be all about the level. The higher your level, the more damage you could deal out, and the more easily you could defeat bosses. At the time, it worked well in games like Final Fantasy because the bosses offered a legitimate challenge, and grinding was the obvious answer to a simple problem: be more powerful than the opponent and grind them into dust. Obviously, there were more skillful ways to get past most bosses, but in the end, if you were simply strong enough, you could run through the game with little to no effort. While the Final Fantasy grind was okay and even fun to a point, hell, you had direct control over the action, the grind in Drakkhen, thanks to its policy of non-intervention, is, well, boring. And believe me, you're gonna grind a lot.